Hello, traveller. Did you know that some of the most detailed Viking maps were never drawn with ink, but etched into memory through storm stars and the sound of a seabird's cry echoing off a cliff face? Tonight, you'll step into the worn boots of a Viking mapmaker, not a raider or warrior, not a saga singer or blacksmith, but the quiet soul who shaped the wayfaring dreams of a people who feared no sea. You'll trace coastlines with your fingers' red cloud patterns like prophecy, and learn that sometimes the most accurate maps are the ones no one else can see. And yes, you definitely wouldn't survive a single day in the Viking Age, not with your screen brightness turned up that high. So before you dive into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Of course you don't have to. We're not feudal lords, just storytellers. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from across the world. Now, turn off the lights, find a position that feels right for you, and let's begin tonight's story. Your name was never the loudest at the feast. When warriors pounded the table and songs filled the smoky hall, you often sat near the edge, tracing patterns in spilled mead with a fingertip. Not because you weren't welcome, but because your eyes were always elsewhere. You watched the way smoke curled, the way shadows lengthened against wooden beams as the fire crackled low. And when you listened, really listened, you heard something most missed: the directions hidden in laughter, the compass points buried in tales. You weren't born to chart maps. No Viking child was. But you were born into the maps, into the fjords and ridges, into the way the wind shaped your cradle, and the sea sang lullabies only your bones remembered. Your father carved keels, your mother dried fish, your brothers sailed west for silver, but you watched seagulls. You tracked the tides with a stick and a line in the sand. You remembered the way morning light hit the rocks on the far side of the bay. You knew by age 7 how to find north by licking your finger and feeling which side cooled first. You didn't know what cartography meant. You didn't know it had a name. But you knew that places had shapes, and that those shapes had stories, and that someone had to remember them. You were quiet, but not timid. There was a difference. When storms rolled in, you didn't run inside. You stood on the headland, arms spread wide, letting the sea spray sting your cheeks. You learned more from wind than from words. The old women in the village whispered you had a crow's eyes and a seal's patience. At 10, you carved your first map into a slab of driftwood. Not a map in the way scholars might understand: no neat compass, rows, no measured scales. But there, notched by your own hand, was the bend of the bay, the crooked rock where herring gathered, and the spot where a ship had once been dashed to matchwood years before you were born. You kept that piece of wood under your sleeping furs. It smelled like salt and sap, like memory. Every Viking was in some way a navigator. The sea didn't allow passengers. If you couldn't read the horizon, you'd join it. But you weren't just sailing from place to place. You were watching the sea for what it was trying to say. Maps to you weren't instructions. They were reflections, echoes, memory stitched into form. Your village was small, no more than 30 huts, one longhouse, a blacksmith's lean-to, and a shallow harbour that echoed like a drum at low tide. But to you it was the centre of the world. Not because of its size, but because it was where all your bearings began. Every voyage since would loop back to this spot. even if only in your mind. The men joked that you couldn't swing a hammer, but you could point to the stars and name them like cousins. That you could find your way home, blindfolded with nothing but a seabird's cry and the smell of the tide. They weren't wrong. At 13, you were asked to carve a travel stick, a haphazard staff inscribed with symbols. But instead of runes for luck or gods, you carved coastlines. Not just the familiar ones. Ones you'd never seen, but had heard described in whispers, the notched peninsula beyond the whale path. The dragon-tail island shaped like a curled worm. The sharp-toothed archipelago, where the sun never set in summer. You began to understand something strange and beautiful that many people travel, but few remember where they've been. You made it your duty to remember, to draw in bark and bone and breath the lines that others forgot. And so you became a mapmaker. Not by title, the Vikings had no guild for that. No scroll to declare your trade. But when a ship needed guidance, they sought you. When someone returned with tales of strange shores and silver-haired people, they told it to you first. Because they knew you'd listen. You'd ask the shape of the hills, the sound of the birds, the taste of the water. And you'd remember. Memory, you learned, was the ink. And time the parchment. Maps faded. But stories could be sharpened until they cut clean through the fog. And that was the beginning. Before the compass, before charts were squared and oceans gridded like a merchant's ledger, there was only instinct. Instinct and observation so sharp it could slice mist. You didn't have a compass. You barely had paper. What you had was the sun on your skin, the wind in your hair, and the peculiar way shadows behaved when the gods were in a mood. Vikings didn't navigate with certainty. They sailed with memory myth and bone-deep intuition. And you as a mapmaker had to make sense of all that, without ever pretending to be certain. Most mornings began with standing still. You'd step outside, boots sinking slightly in the damp grass, and just listen. Not for words, for the pitch of the gulls' calls, the rustle of the pines, the slow pulsing breath of the tide. Was it coming in? Was it angry? Was it swollen with meltwater from distant peaks you'd face east? Not because someone told you, but because you felt it. The east had a particular taste in the mouth, a hint of warm salt and birch pollen. The sun rose differently depending on the season. You learned that it never rose from exactly the same spot 2 days in a row. You carved tiny notches on a rock ledge, one for each sunrise. Over the seasons they formed an arc, a crude calendar perhaps, or an accidental sundial. You didn't think in terms of degrees or latitude. Those were the obsessions of later minds. No, you thought in angles of driftwood, the weight of the wind, the direction a raven veered when startled. Some called it magic. Others called it madness. You knew it was attention, because if you paid attention, the world whispered. It whispered through cloud formations low, and bruised meant rain by night. Tall and feathered meant a shift in wind before noon. It whispered in how the sheep lay down in the field, or how the smoke from the longhouse chimney bent sideways even on a still day, and it whispered loudest at sea. Imagine this. You're aboard a nar, wide-bellied and sluggish, packed with goods for a southern market. The sun has been hidden for 2 days. The sky is a dull smear of pewter. Waves slap the hull like impatient hands. No stars, no sun, no land. And yet, you close your eyes, stretch your arms slightly, and you feel the pressure on your right cheek. The wind is no longer from the northwest. It's shifted almost imperceptibly by a hair's breadth toward north-northwest. The current pulls differently too. The rudder groans in protest where it had once glided smoothly. You know, not guess. No. You alter course 3 finger widths to port, and that somehow leads you home. How do you teach that you can't? But you can watch, you can remember, and you can carve those memories into something that feels solid. So that's what you did. Your maps didn't begin with ink. They began with days like that, with wind and gut again. And only after surviving them did you return to your cabin, unroll a piece of stretched lambskin or smoothened bark, and begin to draw. But what is a map really without coordinates or borders? For Vikings, it was a song in visual form, a story encoded in curves and dots and runes, a promise that someone had been there, and maybe could be again. You often began with the coastline, a jagged, uncertain thread, winding its way from memory to material. You'd mark the wide bay shaped like a whale's mouth, the cliff that glowed amber at sunset, the narrow channel where the wind always howled no matter the season. You'd sketch islands where the trees grew at angles, as if perpetually bowing to some unseen god. You'd draw the location of a freshwater stream, not because it mattered to royalty, but because a thirsty sailor would kiss your boots for it. You didn't draw in straight lines. The sea had no straight lines. Instead, you drew relationships. This rock led to that cove if the wind came from the east. That cove led to the trade outpost if the tide was rising. You'd use dots for dangers, a symbol for reefs, a coiled mark for whirlpools. You invented your own shorthand, a seagull for watch the skies, a bear paw for hungry woods. No one told you to. No one taught you. It just made sense. And over time, those who couldn't read your maps learned to trust them anyway. Because while others brought home loot, you brought home something rarer: orientation. You made the world seem a little less unknowable, a little less lonely. And let's be honest, for a Viking that was no small feat. Back then, fear of the unknown was thicker than fog. Beyond the familiar lay stories of sea serpents' islands that sank when touched lands of eternal night. You didn't just chart territory. You offered courage disguised as scribbles. You showed that someone had been there and survived. Sometimes people asked, "Do you ever get lost?" You'd smile faintly and say, "Only when I forget to listen." Because that's what it came down to always. Listening to wind, to sea, to memory, to the map you carry not in your hand, but in your bones. Child of the fjords. You remember that name. It was spoken by a skald, once a travelling poet with frost in his beard and songs woven like cloaks around his shoulders. He didn't know you, not really, but he called you that, and something about the way it echoed in the longhouse made you sit a little taller, because that's what you were. Born where the mountains bowed to the sea and the sea answered only with salt and fury, where gulls cried louder than infants and moss grew thick enough to swallow boots, where the wind had names and you knew most of them before you could properly pronounce your own. Child of the fjords, not of land or sea, of both or neither, balanced somehow in that trembling space in between. Your village wasn't much to look at unless you knew where to look. 30 huts maybe scattered like dropped dice along the rocky ledge above a thin crescent harbour. But to you, every stone had a story. Every hill knew your name. The fjord was your first map, not drawn, but felt. Its sharp inlet, carved by ancient ice, now filled with water, as dark and reflective as a raven's wing. On calm days, it was a mirror to the sky. On stormy days, it roared like a god. You learned to read it the way others read sagas, its moods, its secrets. The cliffs that rose on either side weren't just obstacles, they were sentinels. The left side, always catching morning light, was named Solveig, the sun wall. The right, brooding in shade, was Skugaheim, the shadow home. Not official names, of course, just yours. But the other children began using them too. And just like that, the world started to organize itself around you. The tides were the village's clock. You knew it was morning not by rooster crow, but by how far the sea had crept up the landing stones. You measured hours in gull flights and the stretch of shadows. Your first chores involved hauling water, a dull task perhaps, but you turned it into exploration. You took the long way always, past the boulder that looked like a sleeping bear, past the bend in the stream where the moss glowed bright green even in winter. You kept notes not on paper, but in your head. A mental catalogue of turns and sights and smells. You didn't know you were making maps, but you were. And then one day, you met the old man. He wasn't from your village. No one quite knew where he came from, only that he arrived one spring, limping up the dock with a sack that clinked like bones, and a beard that held the smell of foreign coasts. He called himself Ivar, and he asked for no coin, only a place by the fire and a bowl of warm porridge. In exchange, he told stories, strange ones, of rivers that boiled in the sun, of stars that moved wrong, of places where trees had blue leaves and beasts walked on two legs but wore no skin. You listened. Of course you did. But more than that, you questioned. And that apparently impressed him. One morning, as you watched him draw lines in the dirt with a broken stick, you asked, "What are you doing?" "Remembering," he said, "and teaching." That was the first time someone ever called it a map. Not a doodle, not a child's game, a map. He showed you how to orient it. North wasn't always up. Sometimes he said it made more sense to put the rising sun on the right because that's how most people lived walking toward it. Maps, he whispered, aren't about truth. They're about belief. You chewed on that for weeks. He showed you how to make ink from soot and fish oil, how to sharpen a bone into a stylus, how to recognize safe parchment smooth but not slippery. He taught you the symbol for danger, for deep water, for trust this shore. Some nights you'd sit together on the rocks and just listen to the sea. Always listen to the old gods, he said once. They whisper through the tides. You thought he was being poetic. Later you realized he wasn't. The fjord was more than backdrop, it was mentor. It taught you through immersion, not instruction. When the tide went out, you saw the paths the crabs had carved into the sand. When it came in, you watched the seaweed dance not aimlessly, but with a current-led rhythm. You mimicked that rhythm in your sketches, your stories, your steps. Your mother worried you were too strange. Other children play. You trace clouds and talk to birds. You smiled. Birds knew more than people gave them credit for. And clouds. Well, clouds were sky maps, drifting invitations. Sometimes late at night when the village slept, and the fire in the longhouse guttered low, you'd sneak out with a small lump of charcoal and draw maps on the underside of flat stones. Maps not just of places, but of feelings. The way fear feels at the edge of a foggy cliff. The way wonder opens your chest when you see the aurora flicker green across a black sky. Those maps made no sense to anyone but you, but they mattered because they reminded you that a place isn't just where it is. It's how it feels to be there. And if you could remember that, really remember, then you could guide others, not just across land or sea, but across experience, because that's what you were slowly learning. A map isn't a tool, it's a story. And you, child of the fjords, were learning to tell it better than anyone else. The first map. No one remembers their first breath, their first dream, or their first lie. But you remember your first map. It was late spring, the kind where the snow still stubbornly lingered in the shadows of rocks while wildflowers dared to bloom anyway. You'd found a smooth, pale shard of whalebone washed ashore after a storm curved like a question and bleached almost to ivory by sun and salt. You knew immediately what it was meant to be. It wasn't some grand moment. No divine light split the clouds. No thunder cracked in applause. Just you, a bone and an itch in your fingers like something needed to be let out. So you did what made sense. You crouched by the fire pit, selected the sharpest sliver of driftwood, and began to scratch. Not draw. Not exactly. You weren't trying to make it pretty. You were trying to make it true. The lines weren't perfect. Your hands still trembled with the kind of intensity only young creators know. But you carved what you knew: the curl of the bay, where the water turned a greener shade at high tide, the rocky outcrop that resembled a hound's snout, the narrow trail behind the fish racks, where gulls nested in tangled reeds. You etched a small mark near your home. Not a house, just a single dot. That dot was important. It meant, this is where I am. Even now you understand every map begins there. There was something holy in it, not religious, but sacred in its intent. Like you were pulling the land out of your memory and pressing it into the world with your own hands. Of course, when you showed it to your brothers, they laughed. This one said, tilting the bone, "Looks like a rabbit after a bear chewed it." You smiled but didn't explain. You couldn't really. Some things don't translate, but your mother kept it. Wrapped it in a scrap of wool and tucked it in a box with dried herbs and small treasures. A broken brooch, a feather from a white raven, a sliver of amber shaped like a teardrop. She didn't say much about it, but once when she thought you weren't listening, you heard her murmur to a neighbor, "Strange child. Makes bones remember." You liked that. From then on, you began collecting things. Bones, bark, flat stones, anything that felt receptive, as if it wanted to be a map. You'd trace with charcoal first, then etch once you were sure. Some days you filled 5 or 6 pieces. Other days nothing felt right. That was fine too. You were learning that waiting was part of it. You learned that the materials mattered. Whalebone was smooth but brittle. Birch bark curled in the heat but held ink like a secret. Pine slats were dependable if dull. And river stones. Oh, the river stones, they were stubborn. But when they accepted your lines, they held them like memory holds the sound of a loved one's voice. Your second map was less personal. It was for your friend Hilda, whose family often traded across the ridge path to a neighbouring valley. She asked, half joking, "Could you draw the route so my uncle stops getting lost?" You did. And then her uncle didn't get lost. Suddenly others were asking, not just where is, but how far? How long is there a spring nearby? Does it flood? You hadn't realised how valuable your memory was until others started treating it like currency. That was the shift. You weren't just a dreamer now. You were useful. So you started thinking differently. You began to walk routes you didn't need just to see where they led. You started asking questions that made elders squint suspiciously. When the river floods, which tree does it reach first? If a man shouts from the West Hill, can it be heard at the shore? Your brain filled with strange equations, not numbers, but impressions. You could remember that from the shadow of the split boulder to the base of the twisted pine took 27 breaths at a brisk pace. You could recall the exact curve of the southern stream's bank, how it always sloped just a little steeper on the east side, perfect for someone in a hurry to refill their water skin. And slowly, without meaning to, you started seeing the world not as scattered places, but as connected paths. You didn't know the word network, but that's what you were building. Your maps were changing, evolving. They stopped being flat representations and became experiences compressed into form. When you carved a hill, you added the direction of wind. When you etched a cove, you included the color of the water at noon. When you mapped a path through the woods, you added a small symbol, a foxtail, to indicate the place where you once saw two foxes dancing. No one else knew what it meant, but you did. And sometimes when you were feeling generous, you told them. Your maps weren't just directions, they were invitations, but they were also personal. So much so that when one of your early works was smudged by a careless merchant's dirty thumb, you felt violated, as if someone had stepped into your memory without knocking. It hurt. But it also taught you something: maps aren't for everyone. Some are meant to be shared, others kept, and some maps are better left unmade. But that's another story. This was your beginning. This was how you learned to see, to listen, to draw not just what is, but what matters. And maybe, just maybe, to leave a little mark on the world. One line at a time. Mentors and storms. It's strange how the two often arrive together. You were 13 when he returned. Not he as in a hero or a long-lost father. Just he, a man with a limp like a cracking mast and breath that smelled faintly of smoked herring and secrets. He wasn't new to the village. He'd been there years ago, long enough to cause a scandal, then long enough forgotten that only the dogs remembered to growl when he walked by. His name was Halvard, and to most, he was a ghost of bad luck and worse choices. But to you, he was something else. He carried with him a roll of sealskin bound by knotted cord. No one asked what was inside. No one wanted to know. But you watched how he touched it gently, reverently, like a man cradling a prayer he wasn't brave enough to speak aloud. One afternoon, under a sky fat with pending storm, you found him alone near the edge of the cliff, staring out at the sea like it owed him an apology. You sat beside him. Silence stretched between you, not uncomfortable, but wide like the space between stars. Finally he spoke. "You're the one who draws maps on bones." It wasn't a question. You nodded. He pulled the sealskin bundle from his pack, unrolled it slowly, and there, you saw it. A map, not yours, not local, but familiar in spirit. It showed a coastline you'd never seen, mountains shaped like jagged teeth, an island, with what looked like a screaming face etched into its center. It was beautiful, terrifying, alive. "Where is this?" you asked, breathless. "Nowhere," he said. "Or maybe everywhere." And just like that, you were hooked. He didn't offer to teach you, not at first. But over time, he started asking questions. Not the usual ones. Not where is north or how many paces from the pine to the stream. Instead, what color is the sea when you're afraid? What shape does the wind make when you lie? Which places don't deserve to be mapped? Those weren't questions with answers, at least not obvious ones, but they made you think, deeper, stranger, sharper. He taught you not by showing, but by daring. He'd hand you a blank piece of bark and say, draw the village as it smelled on market day, or make a map of your favorite memory, but use only animal symbols. And you would. Some attempts were laughable, others haunting. One time he looked at your map of a dream you had once about falling off the world and said without sarcasm, you're getting close. Close to what you never asked. But you wanted to be closer still. He taught you how to bind parchment with sinew, how to press soot into ink with bear fat for permanence, how to heat bone just enough to make it pliable, but not enough to crack. He showed you maps he'd collected from distant coasts, some painted in colors you didn't recognize, others dotted with writing so tight it looked like spider thread. Every culture maps differently, he explained. Some with land, some with stars, some with stories. He once told you of a people far to the east who carved maps into driftwood, but not of where they'd been, of where they'd hoped to go. Aspirational cartography, he called it. You asked if they ever got there. No idea, he said. But the maps were beautiful. You learned more from him in a single season than from years of wandering the hills. But he was no saint. He drank, fought, disappeared for days at a time, came back with bruises and stories that didn't quite add up. You didn't idolize him. You understood too well the danger in that. But you listened. Because under the grime and gristle, Halvard knew things. He spoke of a time when Vikings traded more than they raided. When maps were bartered like bread and explorers left gifts on shores they hoped to revisit. He hated borders. Maps should invite, he once growled. Not lock people out. You never forgot that. Then the storm came. Not metaphorical. Real. Thunder like splintering gods. Wind that howled your name in voices not your own. Most of the village huddled inside. But Halvard. He stood at the cliff's edge, arms wide, cloak flapping like a crow's wings. You joined him. You didn't speak. You just watched. Lightning lit the fjord in silver. The sea turned white with fury. And in that moment, soaked, shivering, unsure whether you were learning or unlearning, you understood. Maps aren't just about where we go. They're about how we stand when the world goes mad around us. That storm took 2 fishing boats, 3 men. It left Halvard shaken quiet for days. And when he finally spoke again, it was this: make maps they'll remember after storms like that. You promised. And he believed you. A month later, he was gone. No goodbye. No message. Only a single bone left by your bed with a rough carving of the cliff edge and 2 small figures' arms raised to a storm. You keep it still, because some mentors leave marks you don't erase, even when the map changes, even when the storm ends. Ink, bone, and bark. They weren't just materials. They were your alphabet, your palette, your trusted companions in the strange dance between memory and matter. By the time you were 15, you knew that a map wasn't just what you drew. It was what you drew with. Each medium had its own voice, its own temperament. Take bone, for instance. Smooth, cold, patient. It remembered the creature it once held together. You preferred whalebone, not just for its surface, but for the weight it carried. Every time your blade scraped into its surface, you felt like you were writing a hymn. Not to gods, but to places, to rivers that curved like sleeping serpents, to valleys that echoed like empty halls. But bone was stubborn. You couldn't rush it. It had no time for mistakes. Your knife had to be sharp, not just sharp, but respectful. You had to find the grain, the subtle give beneath the ivory sheen, and follow it like a whisper. Press too hard, and you'd split it. Carve too carelessly, and it would splinter like dry frost. Bone was best for permanent maps. The ones you wanted someone to hold long after your own fingers were dust. Then there was bark, specifically birch. Birch bark was like a friend you could always count on, even if they occasionally peeled under pressure. It was light, flexible, forgiving. You could roll it, pack it, tuck it under your arm, like a scroll of secrets. It took ink well if you used the right kind. Your ink was homemade, of course. Store-bought ink didn't exist unless you counted that strange merchant from the East who once tried to trade a tiny glass vial of deep violet for half a smoked cod and a night's shelter. You still regretted not taking the deal. So instead, you made your own. You learned to mix soot scraped carefully from the underside of cooking pots with water ash and a few drops of seal oil. The oil gave it body. The ash gave it grit. The soot made it black, deep lasting and stubborn. For finer maps you added powdered berries, blueberry ink for river lines, burnt ochre mixed with goose egg yolk for coastlines, crushed nettle for inland paths. These weren't necessary, no one asked for colour. But to you, they were layers, emotional layers. A red-smeared path meant danger. A green-circled spring meant safety. The ink told the story before your fingers did. Sometimes you used parchment rare and expensive. It came from animals, you knew that. But the idea of peeling a sheep into paper still sat oddly in your gut. Still, when you were gifted a square of it, smooth taut, smelling faintly of milk and lye, you used it carefully, reverently. You mapped your mother's journey from her birth village to your harbour, not because it was dramatic, but because it mattered. That map hung in your hut for years. Visitors asked, "What land is this?" You'd reply, "My mother." They rarely understood. That was fine. There was also stone-flat river stones mostly. They weren't meant for travel. Too heavy. Too fragile when dropped. But when placed carefully, they became stations. You carved short maps onto them, then left them at crossroads, trailheads, river crossings. A message to any who passed someone was here, and they saw. Occasionally, you'd return months later and find your stones moved, rearranged, even answered. Someone had carved new lines, new symbols, a dialogue carried by moss and time. You never knew who. That was the magic of it. Then there were your tools. Your favorite stylus was the sharpened rib of a reindeer. You'd polished it until it gleamed like old ice, bound the handle in leather, and given it a name, Whisper. It fit your hand so well, you sometimes forgot it was even there. For ink work, you used brushes made from squirrel hair, soft, springy, a little temperamental. You had to trim them often. Once during a particularly long night of mapping, you used your own hair. Just a few strands, just to see if it worked. It did, and you kept that brush hidden in your pack. A strange kind of totem. Paper as you understand it now didn't exist. Or if it did, it was whispered about, brought by silk-robed traders who spoke in half syllables and smelled of jasmine and dust. But that wasn't your world. Not yet. Your world was rough, splintered, honest. You felt your maps, literally. You ran your fingers across the grooves in bark. You let your palm absorb the smooth chill of a bone surface. You inhaled the smoky tang of fresh ink and felt something inside you settle. And you realized something profound, though you wouldn't have called it that at the time. A mapmaker doesn't just draw the world. A mapmaker holds it, one texture at a time. The way a song lives in the throat before it's sung. The way grief sits in the soles of your feet. Your materials weren't passive. They were participants. They whispered, argued. Sometimes they flat out refused. You had to coax them. And in doing so, you learned a quiet kind of diplomacy, not with people, but with the earth itself. Because that's what your craft required. Not just ink, not just bark, not just bone, but trust. And once you had that, the world unfolded at your fingertips. The sky as a scroll. You'd always looked up. Long before you knew what the stars were. Long before anyone taught you names like Aldebaran or Thiazi's Eye. You watched them in silence, wondering how such tiny lights could whisper so loudly. To a Viking mapmaker, the sky wasn't just decoration. It was text, a living manuscript written in glitter and smoke edited by clouds and illuminated by the flicker of a dancing aurora. Your first lessons in sky mapping came by accident. You were helping mend fishing nets by the shore when an old sailor face like driftwood, voice like gravel pointed up and said, "If you ever get lost, find the goat." You blinked. "What goat?" He chuckled. "The star with the crooked trail. See that wobbly group there? That's the goat. Follow it west." You didn't see a goat. Not at first, but later that night, you lay on the grass, stared upward, and there it was. Or rather, there it could be. The stars weren't exact. They didn't offer precision. They offered possibility. You began naming your own constellations, not the ones from stories, but the ones you needed. A jagged line like a broken spear that was the warning. 3 tight stars in a downward slope. The shorefall, your signal of approaching land. A swooping hook, the oarsman, who only appeared when it was safe to sail. Later, you learned the traditional ones too. The wain that carried the slain to Valhalla. Orion, though your people called him something different. The stag hunter, who chased the celestial elk across the heavens, never catching, always running. You loved the stories, but what you relied on was motion. The stars moved slowly, predictably. If you stayed up all night, and you often did, you could watch them slide across the sky like ships drifting without sails. You marked their rise and fall with notches on a stick, held it against the horizon, turned it into a crude but effective star clock. And oh, the sun! Most saw it as light. You saw it as anchor. You made sunboards, flat discs carved with lines and slots, used to mark the shadow of a gnomon, helping you guess the time of day, the season, even your direction. Crude, yes. Reliable, surprisingly. But what truly thrilled you were the clouds. The sky's mood rings. To some, they were warnings. To you, they were language. Low rolling clouds with purple bellies meant storm by evening. High wisps curling east like fishhooks suggested a change in wind, sometimes favorable, sometimes treacherous. You began sketching clouds in your journal, inventing symbols, a swirl for high pressure, a smudge for fog, a zigzag for wind shear. You once mapped an entire week of sky as it shifted from clear blue to storm grey to the strange orange glow that sometimes followed lightning. You called that map the mood of the gods. Only you understood it. But that was enough. You learned too about sunstones, those legendary Viking tools, said to reveal the sun's position on cloudy days. Some dismissed them as myth, others swore by them. You found one once, or thought you did. A rough crystal, translucent, but glowing faintly when tilted just right. You kept it in your pouch just in case. Superstition, perhaps. But sometimes superstition is just memory in disguise. And of course, the auroras, the northern lights. When they came, you forgot to breathe. Green rivers flowing across the sky. Sometimes red, sometimes blue. Sometimes with sparks that felt like they might burn your thoughts clean if you looked too long. You didn't map them, not really. You chased them. Marked where they appeared, how they danced, what time they arrived. You swore they responded to emotion. That if you were angry, they twisted. If you were in love, they shimmered brighter. People scoffed. You drew anyway. Some nights, when clouds covered everything, you turned to other signs. You'd hold out a damp hand, feel which way the wind pulled. You'd study the flight of gulls, the silence of crows. You'd light a fire and watch how the smoke rose straight or curling or beaten sideways by gusts invisible to the eye. The sky spoke, always. You just had to listen with more than ears. You learned to layer sky maps over land maps. This trail is safe if Orion clears the trees by midnight. This cove is dangerous unless the hunter's bow rises before dawn. You started carving night maps, constellations, etched into bark with tiny dots of beeswax pressed in to show brightness. You kept them under your furs where they warmed like secrets. And sometimes you dreamed of maps that floated, that hovered above your palm like ghost light shifting with each blink of your eyes. You didn't know what to call them, but you felt their truth. That someday perhaps the sky and the map would become the same thing, not drawn, not remembered, lived. Until then you kept carving. One line for the wind, one dot for the stars, one swirl for the clouds. The sky was your scroll, and your hand, your pen. Sea monsters and margins. You could always tell when a sailor was lying, or more precisely storytelling. The way their eyes widened just a little too much, how their fingers danced in the air like waves, and their voices dropped to a whisper when describing what they saw just beyond the fog. Sea monsters. Every culture has them. But in the north, they were especially vivid. Perhaps it was the cold. Perhaps it was the endless grey. Or maybe the sea really did keep a few secrets just below the surface waiting. As a young mapmaker, you didn't question if monsters existed. You asked where they lived, and more importantly, how to draw them. The margins of your earliest maps were wide and empty, not due to lack of imagination, but because you hadn't yet dared to touch what you didn't know. You focused on the real rocks, coves, the slope of a beach, the color of moss. But one night, around a crackling fire, an old woman named Brynja told you of a serpent that wrapped itself around the world. Not a metaphor, mind you, but a real one with scales like copper shields and a breath that turned the sea to ice. You asked where she saw it. She pointed without hesitation to a spot on your most recent map just past the cape where no one fished anymore. There, she said. Its eye is in that bay. Its teeth are the reefs. Didn't you feel it? You had. You hadn't known what it was, so you etched it. A spiral not too big, not too obvious, but enough to mark the place. And around it you wrote a single rune, Huga, meaning spirit or thought, but also warning. It started a habit, not just of drawing monsters, but of drawing the unknown. Your margins became menageries, not wild cartoonish beasts, but possibilities. A dark fin peeking above the waves where no fish swam. A cluster of circles, some said they were rocks, others said eggs. A line of fire on the horizon that vanished if you blinked. You never claimed these things existed. You just left space for them. Sometimes other sailors added their own marks. You'd return to a map you'd left in the longhouse only to find someone had scratched a crude tail or an eye where your blank space used to be. You never erased them. Even lies contained truth, just shaped differently. There was the tale of the wave that breathed not a creature, but an anomaly, a patch of sea that seemed to inhale. Boats slowed, birds avoided it, sound disappeared. You marked it with a hollow circle, and then there was the silence, a spot far to the west where even the wind seemed unwilling to travel. A sailor came back with hair gone grey and eyes that didn't blink right. He never spoke again. You drew a broken spiral there. No name, no label, just space. Over time, people began to recognize your symbols. They didn't always understand them, but they knew what they meant. Tread carefully. You weren't embellishing. You were respecting. The sea didn't need your permission to be strange, and your maps didn't need to pretend they knew everything. In fact, they were more honest when they didn't. You once had a heated conversation with a trader from the south, a man who believed every map should be neat labeled confirmed. Why would you include fiction? He scoffed. You replied, because fiction often arrives just before fact. He didn't understand. That was fine. You kept drawing. Some days you'd wake from a dream, sweat on your brow. Heart racing, convinced you'd seen a creature too big to understand. You'd sketch it quickly before the memory faded. A long neck, a mouth with rows of teeth like boat nails, eyes like moons unblinking. You never showed those maps. You tucked them away in a box beneath your sleeping furs. Not because you were ashamed, but because some margins aren't meant to be shared. Still, the question lingered. Were you preserving fear or giving it form? Perhaps both. Because a map that pretends to know everything is a lie. But a map that admits its uncertainty, that's truth. And if that truth wears the face of a serpent or the whisper of a wave that sighs like breath, so be it. You weren't just a cartographer. You were a listener. And sometimes, the sea spoke in roars, sometimes in silence, and sometimes in monsters. Mapping myth. You never planned to chart stories. You thought you'd be mapping ridgelines, coastlines, the kinds of places feet could touch and oars could stir. But somewhere along the way, you realized something odd. People don't just remember where they were. They remember what they were told about it. And more often than not, those were myths. You didn't map these tales out of naivety. You did it because myths had gravity. They pulled people toward or away from places sometimes more effectively than any reef or whirlpool ever could. Like the island of the wailing trees. You first heard of it from a boy with one ear and a suspicious fondness for fermented honey. He said the trees there sang at night in voices so mournful they could make a warrior drop his sword and weep. Naturally you laughed. Then your cousin returned from a westward raid gaunt and silent and dropped a bone-carved amulet on your table. Found it in a forest where the trunks were hollow, he said. Hollow and humming. You marked the island on your map, a black smudge ringed with curling lines. Not labeled as real, but not real either. Just present. You came to realize a map isn't just where people can go. It's where they refuse to. And those refusals, well, they usually had a story. One headland, jagged and grey, was said to house a sleeping troll. Not the big lumbering kind, the old kind, ancient, vast. Entire hills formed around his spine. Step too loudly, they said, and the stones will shift. You etched his shape in negative space, an empty outline on the map, nestled among hill symbols, as if the land had been dented by some forgotten truth. Others told of a sea cave, where time slowed. Fishermen who entered before dawn and emerged with sunburns and beards that hadn't been there before. Was it true? Didn't matter. What mattered was that no one fished there anymore. And that's why you added it, a spiral tucked inside a jagged shore annotated only with a rune for change. You found yourself cataloguing these mythic places like a second coastline overlaying the first. A ghost map. You added a faint line across the sea, the serpent's trail, where the sky always turned green at sunset. A lone island shaped like a woman's face, the weeping widow, where ships disappeared if they lingered too long. A glacier to the north that whispers your name as you pass it. You tested it once, sailing past with your crew, silent and shivering. And yes, you heard something. Maybe it was just wind in the cracks. Maybe not. But you marked it. Myth carried weight. Even if it wasn't true in the sense scholars would demand it was functional. It influenced movement, emotion, memory. And as a map maker, that's what you needed to understand. You started to use two sets of symbols. One for fact, land, water, hazard, shelter. One for feeling awe, dread, longing, confusion. Eventually, you found ways to combine them. A curved line might indicate a river, but if it curled twice at the end, it meant strange tides or beware stories. A crescent near a forest edge might suggest a place where the moon never feels right. And yet, not all myths were warnings. Some were invitations. A glade said to bloom with blue fire once a year. A rock that when touched at dawn gives true dreams. You marked those too quietly, respectfully. Let the curious find them if they dared. People began calling your map story scrolls. Some mocked them. Oh, this must be where the gods played dice, they'd chuckle, pointing to a symbol of a giant handprint in the cliffs. But others thanked you. Because when they reached a place your maps had marked with wonder and actually felt it, they understood. Maps weren't just for orientation, they were for emotion. You once tried to map your own dreams. It didn't work exactly, but you found something, a trail of recurring symbols, places that showed up over and over in your sleep. An empty ship, a starless sky, a road made of feathers. You carved them into the margins of your journal, not for guidance, just to remind yourself that not all journeys happen with boots on. Eventually, the line between myth and memory blurred. You stopped trying to separate them. Instead, you asked better questions. Why do people tell this story here? What does it stop them from doing or allow them to dream about? You learned to listen with a cartographer's heart and a storyteller's ear. And in doing so, you built something no raider ever could, a map of meaning. One inked not in certainty, but in belief. Maps that breathe. It began with a simple observation: the world moved, and so your maps had to move with it. The first time you noticed this, you were standing on the bluff above the southern inlet, comparing an old bark map you'd made just 2 summers before. The coastline had shifted subtly, yes, but undeniably. The tide had bitten deeper into the cove, and the boulder you once used as a reference point had tumbled into the sea. You felt a pang in your chest like forgetting a friend's face. That's when it struck you your maps, beautiful as they were already outdated. So you changed your thinking. A map didn't have to be static. It could be alive. Not breathing in the way lungs do, of course, but responsive, evolving. A conversation, not a monument. From that point on, you began making living maps. You called them that, though only to yourself. These weren't scrolls or stones meant to sit in some chieftain's hall. These were maps made of pieces. Modular, rearrangeable. You started with bark slats, long thin strips etched with parts of rivers, bays and forests. Each slat represented a region. As landscapes shifted, you'd remake only that slat. The others stayed intact. Like a puzzle always open to editing. You kept them in a satchel, bundled with twine, ordered by the way wind moved over your home shore. Some nights, you'd unroll the slats on the floor, rearranging them based on new information. A flood that had rerouted a stream, a rock slide that blocked the goat path, a new grove of berry bushes discovered on a trader's return. It wasn't just geography that changed, it was meaning. A safe harbour might become cursed by rumour. A sacred clearing might become a battlefield. So your maps had to absorb stories too. You left blank slats in every set empty space meant for what hadn't happened yet. You called them breathing gaps. Others mocked them. Why waste time drawing nothing? You'd shrug. It's not nothing. It's waiting. Because that's what a good map did, waited. For new truths. For change. You began dating your maps. Not just with numbers, with seasons, with moods. Spring of the long thaw. Autumn of bitter smoke. Moonless winter. You'd write it in the corner small, like a whispered apology to future you. One day a travelling weaver asked if she could borrow one of your coastal maps to chart her dye plants. She needed to track where certain mosses grew, mosses that only bloomed in late spring on north-facing slopes. You adjusted your map, added a symbol for growth, place a small loop like a sprouting bud. That was the day your map became someone else's map too, and you loved it. Because breathing maps didn't belong to a single person. They belonged to moments. You began giving them away, not copies, but the real things. With the understanding that the holder would update them, correct them, live with them. A fisherman returned one slat to you 2 years later. It had new marks, a depth symbol near a previously safe reef, a smudged rune where a shark had been sighted 3 times in one season. He handed it back reverently, like a journal. You smiled and slid it back into the bundle. It didn't feel like yours anymore. And that was exactly right. You had created something collaborative. Others started copying you. Young apprentices made bark slats of their own, carving initials into the corners like artists signing a painting. They'd bring them to you with pride. Here's where the wolves roam now. There's a new ford upriver. The crows have moved nests. Means something's coming. And you'd add them. Carefully. Respectfully. The map was growing. Not wider, not longer, deeper. Sometimes you'd light a fire, spread the slats around you in a circle, and simply sit with them. Not studying, just feeling. And in those moments, you realized something powerful. A breathing map is not a tool. It's a trust between you and the land, you and the sea, you and others, Because once a map breathes, it remembers. It becomes not just a guide, but a witness to erosion, to change, to loss, to discovery, and that you realized was the real work, not just to chart paths, but to honor them, the mapmaker's compass. You didn't always carry one. For years, your compass was the sun on your left cheek, the wind tickling your right ear, the scent of kelp rising thicker on the northern shore. But one day, a merchant from Miklagard, what some would someday call Constantinople, arrived with a tiny delicate object cradled in a walnut box. Inside it, a polished disc of bronze and wood with a needle that floated on a drop of oil and quivered as though it had just been told a terrible secret. He called it a compass. You called it strange, but fascinating. It pointed always in the same direction, north, or what it claimed was north. Even when there's no sun, you asked. Even when the sky weeps, the merchant replied, grinning with too many teeth. It felt like cheating. Still, you watched how it worked, and eventually he let you hold it. The needle danced briefly, then settled silent and sure. It felt unnatural, but also calming. You didn't own a compass until much later. They were rare, expensive, whispered about. And besides, you didn't need one. You had something better. You had feel. Your body was a compass. But when you finally made one, yes, made, not bought, it wasn't elegant. It wasn't small. It was rough wood, a shallow bowl of water, and a sliver of lodestone rubbed repeatedly on an iron needle. It worked. Sort of. The needle pointed somewhere consistent, if not precisely north. So you began to test it. You'd walk one foot in front of the other following the needle. Then you'd compare where it led you to where your instincts said you should be. Sometimes they aligned, sometimes not. That inconsistency fascinated you. The compass became a companion, not a master. You taught your apprentices to use it sparingly. Don't let it replace your senses, you said. Let it challenge them. Over time, you marked its direction on your maps. A small N tucked near the title, often accompanied by a squiggle to suggest this is approximate. Because even with a compass, nothing was ever certain. You added it to your living maps only when you had to. It was a tool, not a truth. One time you followed the compass into a fog bank that lasted for hours. When you finally emerged soaked and cold, you realized you were exactly where you needed to be, but not because of the compass, because of the gulls, because of the rhythm of the tide, because your feet remembered something your mind hadn't caught up with. The compass had helped, but it hadn't guided. That was the moment you coined a saying, let the compass point, but let the world decide. You etched it onto a stone and left it at a crossroads frequented by young travelers. Years later, you found someone had added another line below it. And if all else fails, follow the stars. You smiled. Your compass eventually wore out. The wood cracked. The needle dulled. The oil leaked. You buried it like a fallen companion near the edge of a cliff, where the wind always sang a little louder, because by then you didn't need it anymore. Not really. You had learned to find north in everything, in the lean of a tree, in the curve of a bird's flight, in the stillness before a storm, and perhaps most importantly, in yourself, because the truest compass you ever followed was the one that kept pulling you forward, not toward a destination, but toward understanding, trading secrets. The first time you traded a map, it wasn't for coin. It was for a story. A weather-beaten man with eyes the color of stormwater had arrived at your village, with a cart full of salt spices and strange dried fruits that smelled like fermented sunlight. He wasn't particularly friendly, nor particularly interested in local gossip. But when he saw the rolled bark scroll tied to your belt, he stopped mid-sentence. "Mapmaker," he asked like the word tasted foreign. You nodded. He didn't ask if it was accurate. He didn't ask if it was for sale. He simply reached into his tunic and pulled out a leather-bound scroll that looked like it had survived a fire, a flood, and possibly an argument with a goat. Trade, that was it. One word, one offer. You stared at the scroll. It smelled of mildew and old secrets, but your hands itched. So you handed over your coastal route to the southern fjord, a well-known map valuable mostly to those afraid of getting turned around in the sea fog. And you took his. That night you unrolled it under a sputtering oil lamp. What you saw didn't make sense. Mountains shaped like spirals, rivers with no beginning or end, a city drawn like a handprint, symbols you didn't recognize, not runes, not Latin, not any script you knew, but it pulsed with intent. You traced it again and again, trying to feel what the other mapmaker had felt. And slowly you began to understand. It wasn't a map of place, it was a map of experience. From then on, you traded whenever you could. Maps for maps. Sometimes maps for tales. Once you gave a cave chart to a toothless old woman who claimed to have seen the end of the world. She paid you with a folded scrap of parchment, showing a bridge made entirely of wind. Another time, a sea captain offered you a chunk of driftwood painted with a single glowing red line that ran from top to bottom. "What is this?" you asked. He shrugged. "Don't follow it." You didn't, but you kept it. Because not every map is meant to be used. Some are meant to be witnessed. You began building a collection, a box filled with fragments of other people's journeys. Some maps were beautiful, inked in gold, etched with silver leaf drawn with absurd detail, down to individual pebbles on a path. Others were simple sketches on waxcloth or bark, annotated with hurried symbols and smudged fingerprints. You loved them all, because each one taught you something different. One taught you that sometimes north wasn't the most important thing. Another showed you how some cultures mapped not with lines, but with stories told aloud. You met a navigator from the Far East who never once looked at a chart. He sang, constantly, a low rhythmic melody that changed subtly with every turn of the river. It's the current, he told you. The current remembers. You tried to mimic it once, humming your way through a familiar trail. You tripped over a root and nearly broke your nose. But you kept humming anyway. Your own maps started changing, becoming more collaborative. You'd leave space for notes, comments, even corrections. Sometimes you left them in trading houses with a small invitation scrawled at the bottom. Add what you learn. Erase only what time forgets. People did. One map returned to you with a small drawing of a tree that no longer stood circled in red ink with the note gone but the birds still gather. Another came back with a smell someone had rubbed a spice into the bark, and now the southern pass smelled like warm cinnamon. You loved that. You kept a guest book of maps. Every trader, sailor, wanderer who passed through you asked them to draw something. Not everything, just one place that mattered to them. You ended up with maps of lost wells, of secret paths through berry groves, of small shelters beneath leaning trees where lovers once met. They weren't important in the grand sense, but they were real, and that was enough. You learned to spot fakes, maps drawn to impress, to deceive, to boast. You tossed those into the fire, but the honest ones, the ones that felt like places, those you copied, not to duplicate but to learn. To trade a map was to trade a truth, not always factual, but emotional, felt. And as your own collection grew, so did your reach. People started seeking you out, not just for directions, but for meaning. You had become a keeper of paths, a librarian of the untraveled. And sometimes when the wind was right, you'd open your box of traded scrolls, close your eyes, and let your fingers choose one at random. Then you'd follow it, not because you needed to, but because someone once said, don't follow the line to where it leads. Follow it to see who left it behind. The longship's shadow. You can't map like a Viking without understanding the Viking ship. Not just its shape, but its soul. Because the longship was more than wood and sail. It was a creature, a beast, a map of its own kind carved into the sea. Your earliest memory of one wasn't from a voyage, it was from a funeral. The village had lost a chieftain, not yours but a nearby ally, and they sent him to the afterlife in the old way, aboard a longship lit with fire gliding toward the horizon, like a ghost finally ready to rest. You watched it burn until it was no more than a red eye in the distance, and for days afterward you dreamed of ships that breathed. When you finally stepped aboard your first real longship, not as a passenger, but as a crew member, you realized those dreams weren't far off. It did breathe. It creaked with the rhythm of a sleeping beast, groaned with wind, stretched with wave. And you learned to read its body. The keel was its spine, steady, unbending, guiding everything. The oars were limbs pulling and pushing with purpose. The sail, that was its heart full of wind and will. And the rudder, that was its whisper, nudging the entire creature with the lightest of touches. You'd sit near the prow sketchbook balanced on your knees, etching the shape of the coast as it slid past. But you couldn't just draw what you saw, you had to feel how the ship responded. If the prow dipped slightly after a turn, you knew there was a sandbar beneath. If the rowers shifted their rhythm, you sensed an undertow. If the wind caught the sail too easily, you guessed the bay opened wider than your last map suggested. Every journey taught you something new about the sea, but also about the tool with which you moved across it. You learned that different longships made different maps. A trade ship hugged the coastlines, cautious and fat-bellied, recording every inlet like a miser counting coins. A raiding vessel darted bold and narrow, mapping only what mattered for escape. And the great explorers, those who dared the open sea, they drew straight lines through chaos, chasing stars, with only faith and a firm rudder. You tried them all, not because you wanted to conquer the sea, but because you wanted to understand how it thought. Because a longship didn't just move through the world, it moved with it. You began to draw ship paths on your maps, not just as dotted lines, but as stories. A wide looping arc to show a search for fish, a jagged zigzag where storms forced improvisation, a bold arrow across a blank sea marked only with a note, "We hoped." You documented how different ships reacted to different waters, which hulls creaked in saltier currents, which sails caught best in coastal winds, which oars split fog without sound. You sketched diagrams detailed and obsessive. Some called it madness. You called it preparation, because you believed every map needed a ship's shadow, that without it, the land was only half alive. You even experimented with scale drawing maps from the ship's perspective, not the land's. These were odd creations. Warped coastlines, exaggerated bays, rivers drawn like threads tangled in a giant's fist. But they were useful. Sailors looked at them and felt seen. "This feels right," one murmured once, studying a bend in your sketched fjord. "It's not accurate," you replied. "But it's true," he said. That stuck with you. You began labeling certain maps, shadowed meaning. They were drawn in partnership with the sea through the body of a longship. You kept them separate from your land maps. And when you reviewed them later, you realized something strange. The ship was a better cartographer than you'd ever be. It knew how to move. All you did was listen and sketch and try to remember. So now, whenever you sit to draw a new map, bark rolled flat ink ready, you whisper a small phrase to yourself. Where would the ship go? Because the answer to that question is usually where the map begins, seasons etched in ink. If you've never drawn the same path 4 times in a year, you don't really know it. Because nothing stays the same between winter's breath and summer's burn. You learned this the hard way. You once mapped a forest trail in the spring when wild garlic filled the air and the ground was a spongy carpet of moss and bloom. Every bend made sense. Every shadow fell where it should. 3 months later, you returned, and the trail was gone. Not literally, of course. The land was still there, but it felt different. The undergrowth had thickened. The trees had stretched toward a different sun, and the air was heavy with the songs of insects you hadn't heard before. The path twisted in ways your spring map didn't recognize. That's when you realized you needed more than one map. You needed 4. And so began your seasonal setter map for each phase of the year. Spring's was green-inked, soft-edged, full of hope and hidden paths. Summer's burned with color, its borders overgrown and bold. Autumn's was crisp, detailed, marked with warnings slippery when wet watch for rot bear den nearby. And winter's was stark, sparse, silent, not because you forgot details, but because the land forgot them. Snow erased footprints, ice covered rivers, wind redrew the tree line every day. You learned to see the world as a series of masks each season, a layer pulled tight over the same bones, but painted with entirely different emotions. You once drew the same meadow in April and again in January. Side by side, the maps looked like they came from 2 different worlds. One buzzed with life and possibility, the other whispered. And that's the thing about seasonal mapping. It's not just about temperature or visibility, it's about mood. A trail safe in July might be treacherous in October, not because it's steeper, but because it feels lonelier. That matters, especially when your maps are read by people who trust them with their lives. You began adding seasonal markers, small runes tucked beside landmarks color-coded, or carved at specific angles to catch the low winter sun. A dot next to a spring might mean flowing until frost. A line through a pass might mean closed by snowdrift after first freeze. And the animals, oh how they changed with the seasons. You started tracking migrations, the ducks that appeared in droves each autumn blotting out the sky. The reindeer trails that shifted south with the chill, Even the insects, their hums, their paths, their sudden silences. Each creature left clues, and each clue became a layer on your growing seasonal archive. People began requesting season-specific maps. I need the summer trail to the high pastures. Is the winter pass to the fjord still walkable? You obliged. And then you went further. You experimented with multi-season maps, rotating discs, layered bark scrolls, even a few etched bone panels that could be flipped to reveal how a region evolved over time. It wasn't about innovation. It was about respect. Respect for the land's cycles. Respect for memory, not just yours, but the Earth's. Once a trader mocked your approach. What's the point, he asked. A path's a path. You looked at his frostbitten toes, said nothing. He didn't return the following winter, but others did. They brought you dried herbs, new inks, wax to seal your parchment against sleet. One woman gave you a jar of honey in exchange for a winter map of the high ridge she was seeking her lost brother. You never asked if she found him, but the jar sat on your shelf for years, half full, sweet, silent. You began to view time itself as a terrain, mapped not with distances, but with return. You didn't just draw lines from place to place. You drew loops, circles, revisits. Because mapping the seasons wasn't about where you went. It was about when, and who you were when you returned, the language of lines. At some point, your maps began speaking. Not in words, not in sounds, but in something deeper. Line. Every stroke you etched into bark or burned into bone or inked onto hide, it meant something. And not just the what, but the how. A straight line could be a road, or a command, or a certainty. A curve. That was softness. Hesitation. Sometimes invitation. Jagged lines were never just cliffs, they were danger. Drama. A warning shouted through geometry. You didn't invent this language. It revealed itself to you. One long, cold night, you sat alone, redrawing a known river from memory. Your fingers moved before your thoughts did, and what came out wasn't the river's shape, it was its rhythm. Wide loops where the fish were lazy. Tight turns where the current snapped like a wolf's jaw. Dotted tributaries like scattered laughter. And you realized you weren't mapping geography. You were mapping emotion. That's when you started developing your personal lexicon. Lines for direction, thin and faint like suggestions. Lines for certainty, bold, deep, carved so hard your stylus sometimes bled. Lines for danger, crosshatched, trembling, like the land itself had flinched. And then there were memory lines. You didn't mark them with names or routes. You simply traced them again and again whenever your thoughts drifted. A walk to your father's grave. A trail behind the house where you first kissed someone and thought, so this is what being real feels like. They weren't practical, but they were true. Others began to notice. Why do your maps move when I look at them? Someone asked once. You didn't answer. Because the lines did move. Not literally, but in meaning, because line is language. And you were learning to speak fluently. You experimented with thickness, with pressure, with directionality. If you drew a line upward with a firm, bold stroke, it felt like hope. If you dragged it down slowly, it became grief. And then you added symbols, not letters, not runes, just shapes born of the line itself. A broken spiral to indicate a place of strange memory. A nested triangle for locations where choices once mattered. A set of parallel dashes, uneven meaning uncertain path, but worth it. Soon your maps looked like nothing anyone else made. They weren't prettier, they weren't clearer, but they were felt. People began asking you, not where is this, but how does this place feel? You always smiled, because that's the real question. You started teaching apprentices, young ones mostly, eager, wide-eyed, full of ink stains and questions. You gave each their own symbol and told them, find a line that belongs only to you. One drew in quick bursts, short, thick strokes. His maps were passionate, chaotic, honest. Another mapped in spirals, always coming back to the center. Her work felt meditative, like prayer. You didn't correct them. You translated them, helped them read their own lines. Because that's what language does, it reveals the speaker. Your lines began to overlap. One line was a path and a regret. Another a river and a memory of a song sung on its banks. It got messy, but also beautiful. Because the world isn't clean, and neither is the truth. You started drawing layer maps, the same location mapped multiple times, each layer focused on a different emotion. Top layer geography, next danger, next longing, next loss. People found them confusing. You found them comforting. Because you were no longer just a map maker. You were a line speaker, a cartographer of the felt, not just the seen. And the greatest line you ever drew, it wasn't on bark or bone. It was in the snow. One winter evening, you traced a path with your foot, walking in slow, deliberate curves across the white field outside your hut. A young girl watched from the hill. "What are you mapping?" she called. You looked back at the trail behind you, then smiled. "Myself. Storm maps and wind whispers. If you ever want to understand fear, try mapping during a storm. Not just watching it. Not just waiting it out from the safety of a longhouse. Being in it. Feeling the sky crack open like an angry god had tripped over a mountain, thunder rolling across your spine, wind slicing sideways through your thoughts. Rain so thick it became a second sea, drenching the world, washing away lines and landmarks alike. That was the night you invented your first storm map. It wasn't intentional. You'd gone out to check a tidal path, foolish. Yes, you know that now. And the weather turned so fast, the sky didn't darken, it collapsed. You found shelter under a rock overhang, shaking ink bleeding in your satchel, and with numb fingers, you started to sketch what you felt. Not saw, felt. You mapped the gusts, short dashes where the wind bit, swirling coils where the air spun in maddening circles, dripping curves to show where the storm bled sideways through the trees. When you made it home soaked cold, but buzzing with the kind of clarity only terror brings you, looked at what you'd drawn and realized you had made a weather map, not like those future scholars would chart with satellites and formulas. No, this was personal, immediate, alive. You began experimenting. Each storm you'd observe from different vantage points, cliffs, forests, hills, even half-submerged rocks. You tracked how wind behaved differently in valleys versus open fields, how some trees bent east, others snapped west. You studied the whispers, those eerie moments when everything stilled right before the downpour. That silence became a symbol in your storm lexicon, a broken line with 2 dots. It meant now, run. You learned to hear the wind like a language. Low hums meant pressure building. High, thin shrieks meant air funneling through something it shouldn't. You could tell by the shift in breeze when rain would change direction or stop entirely. That's when you realized wind warns, if you listen. So you began mapping it, You created wind roses, not the polished ones of future navigators, but rough bark discs with inked streaks to show common gust paths in each season. You planted them in high places, let others rotate them, use them, and they worked. You created storm prediction charts, hand-carved symbols, notations of bird behavior, cloud shape, even how your joints ached. People thought you were mad, until your maps started saving lives. One autumn, a merchant caravan avoided the high pass because your storm glyph, 3 twisted lines in a triangle, warned of a coming gale. It hit the next morning. They returned a week later with dried apricots, gratitude, and an offer to fund more of your sky sketches. You refused the coin, took the fruit, added a new line map confirmed by weather. Your reputation changed. You weren't just the map maker, you were the storm reader. Sailors sought you out before voyages. Farmers asked if the wind whispered of frost. Even hunters began marking your storm runes on their own trails. And you kept listening, because wind never lies. You mapped where thunder echoed deepest, where lightning struck most often, where fog rolled in like a living thing and refused to leave. Each storm became a lesson, not in fear, in rhythm, in movement, in the way the sky sings when no one is listening. Your most treasured storm map was never shared. It was from a night you nearly didn't survive. You'd climbed the cliff to chart wind patterns during a winter squall. It was supposed to be light. It wasn't. You slipped, fell, caught yourself. By morning, your fingers were blue, your eyes bloodshot, but your scroll was dry, tucked beneath your chest, warm from your heartbeat. It showed nothing dramatic, just a subtle shift in gusts along the ridgeline, a tiny curve where before there had been none, but it meant something. To you, it said, you are still here. Storms don't erase the world, they reveal it, one gust at a time. And you captured that revelation, with ink, with breath, with a whisper from the wind, a visit to Byzantium. They told you it was impossible, too far, too foreign, too different. But you went anyway. And the moment you arrived in Byzantium, or as they called it, Constantinople, your maps caught fire. Not literally, but close enough. Because this city wasn't drawn, it was unleashed. Sprawling, glittering, humming with a language of stone and silk. Roads that stretched like veins, domes that glittered like sunstones, and walls that carried the weight of centuries. You had never seen anything like it. You thought your northern villages were grand in their stubbornness, their sea-bitten architecture, their bold simplicity. But this was geometry in bloom. You entered through the sea gate, sailing past towering statues that seemed to breathe in the morning mist. Your longship felt like a child's toy lost among marble giants. You didn't speak the tongue, not fluently, but the city didn't care. It welcomed you. You stayed in a quarter thick with foreign tongues, Norse, Arabic, Armenian, Latin. Every corner spoke a different truth, and every alleyway had a map waiting to be discovered. Your senses worked over time. The smell of cinnamon and sweat, the glitter of mosaic tiles underfoot, the sound of water trickling through fountains shaped like lions and saints. You began mapping not geography, but pattern. Market stalls formed loops around sacred columns. Pilgrims moved in spirals through courtyards. The shadow of the Hagia Sophia fell exactly on the same tile. Each morning at dawn, you marked it religiously. And then there were their maps. Oh, traveller, Byzantine maps were art, not just functional but devotional. Some weren't meant to guide ships or soldiers, they were meant to guide souls. Circles within circles, gold leaf cities set like jewels on parchment, the world imagined as a divine plan. You didn't scoff. You studied. You traded a northern storm map for a silk scroll of the eastern world. It showed India as a flaming sword and Africa as a lion's paw. None of it was accurate. All of it was meaningful. You met a scribe who mapped books showing the way ideas traveled from Alexandria to Antioch to Constantinople to Rome. He called it intellectual cartography. You just called it brilliant. Together, you shared ink. You taught him to mark trails by wind and stars. He taught you to measure faith in footsteps. You were changed. Your maps back home had been functional, sturdy, often beautiful, but now they were layered. You started using color in ways you never had. Blue not just for water, but for the unknown. Gold for sacred places, not because gods lived there, but because people believed they might. You drew your homeland as you'd never seen it before, not as a coast or a kingdom, but as a network of choices. Trade routes, prayer paths, love trails, exile tracks. You began drawing human maps, not where people lived, but where they moved. Byzantium had shown you the truth: the world is not fixed. It pulses, it dances, and a good map doesn't just capture place, it captures motion. When you finally left scrolls in your satchel, eyes burning from the brightness of everything, you turned back one last time at the city gates. You didn't weep, but your hand lingered on the wall as if to say, "I will carry this." And you did. For years. Every time someone asked where you learned to layer maps like stories, you just said one word: Byzantium. When the map lies, it was bound to happen. You drew a line, a clear, confident line, a path through the pinewood east of the old river bend. You'd walked it a dozen times. You knew the way, like the back of your hand, the mossy stone, the crooked birch, the spot where the deer paused, like they were remembering a forgotten song. So you etched it. And someone followed it, and they didn't come back. At first you told yourself it wasn't your fault. Storms could have shifted the trail. Maybe they got lost after leaving it, or maybe they had never intended to return. But deep down, you knew. You went back, retraced every line, every mark, and there it was, a fork, barely visible. A narrow deer trail that used to be blocked by fallen logs, logs that were gone now. Rot had taken them. Time had opened the way. And your line, it pointed toward the wrong one, not the main path. Not anymore. And so your map had lied. Not because of malice, but because the world moves faster than memory. You sat with that mistake for a long time. You didn't draw that day. You didn't speak much. You watched the trees sway and wondered how many other paths you had drawn that might have changed without asking permission. Then slowly, you began a new kind of map. One marked not just with paths, but with confidence levels. Solid lines for what you knew. Dotted lines for what you suspected. Wavy lines for routes that shifted with season, or weather, or whim. And perhaps most importantly, you added question marks. Small ones, discreet, placed beside trails you hadn't walked in a while. You even added a note at the bottom. All maps lie a little. This one tries not to. Some loved it. Others hated it. What good is a map that's unsure, they'd ask. You'd shrug. What good is a lie that leads to a cliff? You started dating your maps more rigorously. Not just seasons now, but conditions. This path clear during dry weeks, flooded last spring, unknown now. Treefall reported unconfirmed. You reached out to others, began building a network of verifiers travelers who'd agree to report changes, corrections, oddities. They sent you notes on wax-sealed bark or carved into bone, or simply whispered by traders over mead. You updated accordingly. Some folks still didn't care. They wanted clean lines, absolute truths, but you'd seen what those could cost. So you kept drawing your new way, and you added a symbol to your legend one not many noticed. A crooked circle open on one side, meaning truth, but with space for change. You called it the open eye. Some called it cowardice. You called it honesty. And when an apprentice once asked you, "What do you do if a map lies again?" you paused, then said, "Admit it, fix it, and never pretend it didn't." Because that's the burden and the blessing of a mapmaker. You draw what others will trust. You chart what others will follow. And sometimes when you get it wrong, you're the only one who can make it right. So now, every time you finish a map, you whisper a quiet blessing over the ink. May this guide not deceive. May this suggest, not command. May this remember to forget. And then you send it out into the world. Imperfect, incomplete, but honest. The silence between stars. It's one thing to map the earth. It's quite another to map the sky. At first you didn't try. Stars were the domain of mystics and poets, not cartographers. What could you possibly chart up there that hadn't already been named by someone in a robe whispering to smoke and shadow? But then came that night. You were alone, far from home, curled in a bed of moss that still held the warmth of the day. No fire, no torch. Just you, your breath, and the stars. And they weren't still. They shimmered. They pulsed. They whispered things you couldn't quite hear, but you felt them. It was the space between the stars that caught you. The silence. You pulled out your parchment, and without knowing why, began sketching. Not constellations, not the moon's position, or the tilt of a planet. Just distance. The relationship between things. That's when you discovered your second sky. The sky as seen by sailors and raiders, yes, but also by lovers and dreamers and the broken-hearted. You started asking around. What stars do you trust, you'd ask. One man pointed to a bright cluster. That's where my wife's soul waits. A child said I count 3 in a row and make a wish. An old woman whispered, that crooked one saved me from walking into a cliff in the dark. You began collecting these stories, and you built your emotional star map. You mapped where people looked when they prayed, where they pointed when they missed someone, which stars they blamed when things went wrong. It wasn't about astronomy, it was about meaning. You made charts of grief, of longing, of wonder, dotted with stars, yes, but also marked with notes. This one is always brighter when you need it. Don't look at this one after heartbreak. 3 stars, 1 promise. Some scoffed. This isn't a map, a chieftain said once. It's a diary. You nodded. It can be both. You began including stars on your regular maps, not for navigation, but for orientation of the soul. A trail near a cliff with a star mark that said, "Safe to rest here." Look east at dusk. A river bend noted best view of the summer sky when the moon sleeps. And then there were the silent stars, the ones no one named, the ones that hung just on the edge of vision, blinking slowly, like they were waiting to be remembered. You gave them symbols, not names, just shapes, an open hand, a single tear, a rising hill. Because stars don't care what we call them, but they notice when we look. Eventually, you made a full sky scroll, not for navigation, not for prediction, but for remembrance. Each star marked by what someone had felt beneath it. Some pages burned with passion, stars linked by wild loops and laughter. Others were gentle scattered dots, barely connected, like memories trying not to fade. You kept it wrapped in soft cloth, brought it out only on clear nights. And one day a stranger arrived, said he'd lost his way, not on land, but inside. You gave him the scroll, told him, don't look for direction, look for something that feels like home. He left at dawn. Didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Because sometimes the best maps don't lead anywhere. They just remind you that you're not alone under the sky. The lost map. You were careful, so very painstakingly careful. Every scroll was wrapped tight, every ink sealed, every corner marked with your unique triangle inside circle symbol, your maker's mark. But one day, a map went missing. Not any map. That map. The one you'd drawn after months of wandering, sleeping on roots, following rumors and shadows and the scent of old prayers. A map of a forgotten valley deep in the north where mist never left and the trees grew sideways, as if confused by gravity. You hadn't named the place. You weren't even sure it had a name. You simply called the scroll the Breathing Hollow. It was more than roots and features. It was a story. It had your blood in the ink. Literally, your finger had split while carving a birch symbol, and you let it stain the page. A memory, a mark. And now, gone. At first, you thought you'd misplaced it. Easy enough. Your workroom was a chaos of parchment and bark and whispered wind. But you searched, top to bottom, again and again. It was gone. You sat with that absence like a wound, tried to draw it from memory, failed, not because you couldn't remember where things were, but because you couldn't recall how it felt. And that's what mattered. You wondered who had it now. A thief, a collector, a desperate wanderer who didn't even know what they held. Days passed, weeks, and then a raven, real black as ink with one white feather like a single flake of forgiveness. It landed on your windowsill and dropped a strip of cloth, wrapped inside a copy, not yours. Crude, rushed, imitated by someone who had held your map and tried to remember what you had remembered. But the lines were wrong. The hollow was too wide. The mismarkings absent. The trees straight. You studied it for a long time. Then without anger, without ego, you set it aside. Because that's when you realized something. Some maps are not meant to be copied. Some are not meant to be found again. Some are meant to be lost, so they can be searched for, so you can go back, so you can become the map. You packed lightly, left the scrolls behind, no ink, no stylus, just your boots, your memory, your breath, and you walked. For weeks, maybe longer, the hollow didn't welcome you back. It waited. And when it came, when you finally stood in the clearing again with the sideways trees, whispering the old songs, with the mist curling like shy spirits around your ankles, you didn't redraw it. You just knelt, placed a small stone on the ground, etched a symbol into it, your mark, yes, but broken, split down the center, to show that even truth fractures, even maps disappear. And sometimes the greatest journeys are the ones you lose your way into, teaching the next. They came to you in ones and twos, At first, children mostly curious and smudged with the world, their hands too small for proper styluses, but just big enough to hold wonder. You didn't plan to teach, but how could you not when they sat so quietly beside your work table, eyes wide as scrolls? It began with small lessons. This is how you carve into bark without splitting the grain. This symbol means fog, not cloud. There's a difference. Always note which way the moss grows. It may not matter today, it will matter tomorrow. They listened. Not always well, but always earnestly. You weren't gentle. You didn't lie. You told them that maps were dangerous things because people believed them. And belief, you said, could lead to discovery or to disaster. But you also told them this: making a map is the closest thing to magic we mortals have, because you turn the chaos of the world into something someone else can follow. You taught them to observe before they judged, to feel the path with their feet before they drew it with their hands. And slowly the lessons grew. You watched one girl draw a map of her family's homestead, not the buildings, but the memories. "This tree is where I broke my arm," she said. "This rock is where my brother cried." You didn't correct her, you praised her, because she understood. The next generation wasn't going to map the same world. They'd map new one, more connected, more layered, more emotional. One boy drew in color, only no lines, just gradients. Another refused to use ink mapping solely in smells pressed into wax tablets. You let them, because rules matter, but so does invention. Some apprentices left quickly, couldn't sit still, couldn't accept that mapping took time. But those who stayed, they changed you. You stopped drawing alone. Your workshop became a shared studio, a quiet cacophony of stories being born. They mapped things you never dreamed of. How the echo of a canyon changed with the season. Where the best skipping stones could be found. The migration path of a wandering ghost dog told through sleepwalkers' testimony. And you began to learn all over again. Your role shifted, from maker to mentor, from recorder to releaser, because now your job wasn't to map everything, it was to make sure the mapping continued. You created a library, not of finished scrolls, but of beginnings. Unfinished maps, partial charts, unlabeled symbols, puzzles for the next to solve, to expand, to question. You watched them go off with copies, originals, ideas. Sometimes you never saw them again. Sometimes they returned years later, taller, changed with new maps in hand. One returned with a map of wind-shaped stones that sing during certain solstices. Another mapped silence where it fell thickest across the forest floor. You didn't praise them with words. You just nodded, added their maps to your shelves, and left space for more. Because teaching is not the passing of knowledge, it's the igniting of it. And as you watched them sketch and speak and argue and dream, you knew you wouldn't live forever, but your lines would. In different hands, in different hearts. And that was enough. The places that never were. It started with a mistake. You'd meant to draw a coastline, a jagged, familiar shape carved by years of tide and memory. But your hand slipped. The stylus curved, a smudge bloomed. You meant to erase it. Instead, you leaned in. What if you thought just for a moment this bay existed? So you added a forest behind it, then a narrow path, a village of 12 houses all facing north, a small well, an inn with a crooked chimney, a stone where people left wishes, and just like that, you had created a place that never was, a false map, or so you thought. until someone returned with wide eyes and a story. They'd followed the path, crossed the field, found the well. The village wasn't there, not quite, but something was. A feeling, a whisper, a pull. You laughed at first, then you frowned, then you wondered. How many other places had you created without knowing? How many lines were not mistakes but invitations you began experimenting? One map showed a hidden glade behind a mountain that didn't exist. A boy brought you a drawing he'd found a glade. Different trees, but the same feeling. Another map marked a sea of regret far beyond the known world. A sailor claimed to have seen it in a dream. Deep water, moonlit waves, gulls that screamed like voices you almost remember. You didn't know what to make of it, but you kept drawing. And slowly you came to understand there's a difference between false and imagined. A false map deceives. An imagined one invites. You made a whole series The Possible Maps. They weren't labeled as real, but they weren't lies. They were places of potential. Islands made of laughter. Caves that healed old grief. A tree that remembered every footstep beneath it and whispered them back on rainy nights. You hung them in your hall, and people came. Not for navigation, for inspiration, to dream. One woman wept over a place she'd never visited. "This is where I should have been born," she said. You didn't ask why. You didn't need to. Because that was the magic. These places didn't exist until someone believed in them. And sometimes, belief was enough to find them. One day a traveler arrived holding a tattered scroll. Not yours, but clearly inspired by your work. He'd mapped a mountain shaped like a question mark, said it appeared only when you stopped looking for it. You studied it carefully, then added it to your collection, and marked it verified by wonder. Because in the end, what is a map but a story? And what is a story but a place you visit with your mind? Some will say you lost your edge, that you traded accuracy for art. But you know better. You didn't abandon truth. You expanded it. Because the world is not just rivers and rocks. It's also maybes, could-bes, what-ifs. And those deserve maps too, echoes and footprints. They don't tell you this when you first become a map maker. Your own steps become part of the landscape. Not the land, no, not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Somewhere between bark and ink, you realize the very act of walking a place changes it, just a little. You leave echoes, not sounds, not prints in the soil. Something softer, something harder to erase. There's a path near your home, narrow, rocky, almost forgettable. You walked it often in your youth, humming to yourself, lost in daydreams and storm clouds of thought. Years later you returned. It hadn't changed, but it had. The trees seemed to lean in as if expecting your song. The stones seemed warmer, more familiar. You realized you weren't remembering the path. The path was remembering you. You tested this, walked new routes in silence, then returned months later humming the same tune, whispering the same question, and the land responded, not with words, but with welcome. You began to chart echo paths, places you'd walked not for purpose, but for presence. Paths where your own memory had become part of the soil. Your maps began to carry more than direction. They carried emotion. You marked trails where hearts had been broken, clearings where laughter had rung so loud it left a dent in the silence. A stone beside a river with no markings, except for the time you sat there alone and told it your secrets. Your students noticed. "Why is this place marked with a swirl?" they'd ask. "Because I remembered something important there," you'd say. They nodded, began adding their own. You called them emotional cartouches, symbols, not for geography, but for inner geography. A place where you grieved, a place where you forgave someone, a place where you made peace with being lost. Soon your entire map library hummed with memories. Not just yours, theirs. Theirs too. Every apprentice added echoes, not with words, with presence. One brought a scroll that mapped first's first kiss, first storm alone, first time climbing a tree and believing they could. Another mapped almosts, the trail they nearly took, the river they nearly crossed, the goodbye they nearly said. You began to believe something strange, something beautiful, that the land wasn't just earth and water and air. It was memory clay, and you were part of its shaping. Every walk was a line, every pause a punctuation, every sigh a soft signature. You returned to your oldest maps, not to correct them, to honor them, to say you were here. You mattered, because no matter how skilled the mapmaker, no matter how precise the ink, the most honest maps are made not with hands, but with hearts. The map you didn't draw. You always thought you'd map everything. That if you just kept walking, kept sketching, kept listening, you'd eventually chart every bend in the river of the world. But one morning, grey light slanting through the trees like spilled milk, you realized something odd. You'd stopped mapping. Not entirely, not formally, but the urge to record, to etch, to catalogue had softened. You weren't tired. You weren't done. You were simply quiet. And in that silence, something unexpected began to take shape. A map, but not one you made, not one anyone had made. It lived in your mind, your bones, your breath. It wasn't made of lines or bark or ink. It was made of moments. The first time you held a stylus, the smell of salt air on your first longship voyage, the ink-stained hands of your apprentice grinning like a storm cloud about to burst, the valley you never found again, the child who traced your map and whispered, "I feel like I've been here before." This new map didn't need parchment. It needed presence. You found yourself walking familiar paths without drawing them, just walking, noticing. A ridge that now carried a new echo. A tree you once used as a landmark, now half fallen, its bark peeling like old memories. You understood something then. Some maps are meant to be drawn. Others are meant to be lived. You began visiting people you'd once mapped for. An old hunter who still carried your forest trail in a bone scroll. A widow who framed your seasonal chart above her hearth like a prayer. They told you stories you'd forgotten, or perhaps never knew. How your map helped them find shelter, find each other, find themselves. You smiled, didn't need to add it to the archive, because the archive was no longer yours. It had become theirs. That's when you looked back through your collected works, the lines, the loops, the layered echoes, and you saw it. The real map, not of land, not of sea, but of connection. Your life as a Viking mapmaker wasn't about drawing the world. It was about sharing it, seeing it together, trusting in lines made by hand, by heart, by hope, and in the spaces between them, the space for someone else to dream. The final scroll. You always thought there'd be a last map, a grand finale, one final scroll that said, "Here it ends." But that's not how it happened. There was no thunder, no feast, no final voyage. Just a quiet morning cold tea in your favorite mug, and the sound of birds you couldn't name anymore. You sat at your work table, the same one you'd carved runes into as a child, the same one stained with 1,000 inks, 1,000 thoughts, and realized your hands had stopped reaching for the stylus. Not out of pain, not out of weariness, just stillness. And in that stillness, a strange peace. Your last scroll wasn't a map. It was a letter, to no one, to everyone. You wrote not of mountains or rivers, but of moments, the look on a sailor's face when he realized your storm glyph had saved him. The laughter of children tracing paths you once feared. The way your own breath caught when you found a forgotten trail and knew that you had drawn it years before for someone else. You rolled the letter up, tied it with a red thread, left it on the shelf between the map of possibilities and the path of footprints. You didn't label it, let them wander. Instead, you stepped outside. The wind greeted you like an old friend, familiar, curious, slightly mischievous. You followed it. No parchment, no compass, no plan, because your whole life had been one long map. And now at last, you were inside it. You walked through woods you'd once charted to the inch, crossed streams that had never flowed the same way twice, past stones that remembered your name, or at least the pressure of your boots. And when the sun began to lower, casting gold across everything like a gentle farewell, you found a hill, just high enough to see the horizon. You sat, breathed, and smiled. Because every map, no matter how detailed, ends at the edge of knowing. And beyond that, wonder. Always wonder. Word count 1072. Closing epilogue. And now, dear traveller, as the ink dries and the echoes of wind soften into hush, let your breath slow, let your eyes fall gently shut. You've wandered far tonight across fjords and forests, through laughter, through loss, through all the crooked lines that make a life. You've walked beside a Viking who didn't conquer but chronicled, who didn't claim lands but felt them, who gave not just directions, but meaning. In your own way, you've followed that path. Mapless perhaps, but not lost, because the maps we carry aren't always drawn. They live in memory, in longing, in quiet moments like this where the world softens and dreams begin. So rest now. Let the stars above remember the paths you've loved. Let the land hold your stories. And let your heart, your brave, wandering heart, be the only compass you'll ever need. Good night, traveller. Sleep well.